Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast, JDE Troubleshooting, Connecting JD Edwards to the Database. My name is Amanda Schwab, Marketing Coordinator with GSI, and I'm also very pleased to welcome our main presenter, Bill Rem. Bill leads GSI's database practice, is certified on multiple database platforms, and has been a JD Edwards CNC administrator for almost 20 years. Besides webcasts, Bill conducts on-site training, creates video tutorials, delivers presentations at conventions and user groups, and writes a monthly article in the GSI newsletter, the GSI Insider. Now, before we get started, I wanted to give you a chance to review our safe harbor statement. And now for a quick overview for today's meeting, which will last about 60 minutes. First, I'll take a moment to go over a couple of housekeeping items as well as provide a brief company overview. Then, I'll turn it over to Bill to get into our main presentation, which will last about 40 minutes. Next, we'll take a minute to go over upcoming educational events, and then we'll wrap up with a 10-minute Q&A session. If you would like to submit a question, you can do so through the questions panel at the bottom of the GoToWebinar console window located on the right side of your screen. Please note that questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, so if you would like to minimize your GoToWebinar console during the presentation, just click the right-facing arrow key on the top left of the console. Clicking the left arrow key will return the console so that you can input your questions. And now I'd like to give you a brief overview of GSI. GSI is a full-service JD Edwards consulting organization. We're an Oracle Platinum partner that was founded in 2004 and now has over 100 employees. We have offices nationwide and are recognized on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest-growing companies in the U.S. GSI specializes in project consulting, managed services, and cloud and hosting services, with all of our services backed with a 100% guarantee. GSI also provides a broad spectrum of business, functional, and technical consulting services for Oracle NetSuite, Oracle Cloud, Salesforce, ServiceNow, BMC, and other enterprise applications. In addition, we are a product development company that has many popular products, including Genius is our advanced monitoring and performance analytics solution for JD Edwards or any business-critical system on any platform. Genesis is our load and stress testing application for system design, validation, or expansion for JD Edwards or any web-based business-critical system. G-Shield is our comprehensive security solution for JD Edwards, including password reset and two-factor authentication. Rapid Reconciler, which allows you to effectively manage your inventory, in-transit, and RNV reconciliation processes for any version of E1 or World. Rapid Approval is a Salesforce AppExchange solution that streamlines the approval request process. And now I would like to turn things over to Bill to get into our main presentation and demo.
All right, thanks, Amanda. I'm going to switch presenter here. And make sure it's showing the right screen here.
Yep, I'm seeing your PowerPoint.
Do you see me?
Yes.
Oh, hi there. Good. I am Bill Rem, as she indicated, and that's me right there. And I am trying to move some things out of the way here so that I can see my screen, which you can't see. So, all right, so I'm going to talk about today JD Edwards connecting JDE activity with database processes, and this is something that a lot of people have an interest in. It's near and dear to my heart since I've been trying to do this forever. It's an interesting study. It's not a lot of connectivity between the database and JDE as it relates to logging, but I'm going to tell you all the things that I do know about it. So why do you need to know how to connect the database to JD Edwards? Well, some of you probably already know, but if you had any experience troubleshooting problems in JD Edwards, you know that the database is, most probably involved in almost everything. Table locks and blocking might be caused by an application, but the best way to track it down is to work backwards from the blocking session on the database. And if you got some slow performing UBEs or applications, you could have some really crazy SQL statements set in the database. And maybe you just have no idea what's going on at all, and you just need to start taking this apart piece by piece, go through the process and check everything, all the way from the human down to the data. And this is really difficult because JDE is just one part of the installation, and the database has its own ecosystem. And each side really only cares about what it's doing. And they may pass messages to each other, but they don't really connect except to Exchange SQL statements. And JD Edwards was really designed from the bottom up to retain all of the administration for everything inside of itself. It wasn't built to take into consideration proper tuning of the database. It's all JDE centric, and as a result, some of the best practices and habits inside JDE actually make some database problems worse. But you have to figure that out eventually and somehow through the JDE logs. So the database passes messages to JD Edwards through the JDE logs. And unfortunately, those messages don't always make sense. The database doesn't report everything back to JD Edwards, and the JDE just doesn't ask. And some messages might only seem to be database related, but they could be coming from the client connection software. And as I mentioned, only some information is captured by the database. It will capture things about a JDE session. If it's doing something in the database, it'll grab the originating server name and also the user that is connecting to the database. There's really no information about what's going on inside JD Edwards. It knows that it issued a SQL statement, and that's it. And it knows where it came from, but it doesn't know that it's happening as part of an application or any particular process, or whether it's third party or JD Edwards, it doesn't matter. The database doesn't keep track of that kind of stuff unless you've developed the application inside the database, which is not what JD Edwards is. So it really makes it to where logging can be really confusing, because inside JD Edwards, even the logging doesn't really separate things out by person or process. It's just it's like a brain dump of all the information. And another level of complication is that we have the system user. And for those of you who don't know what that is, JD Edwards communicates to the database through one user. Usually, that's by default. You can set up multiple users if you want, but this one user, usually JDE, it used to be PSFT, but that user inside JDE, everything that every user does inside JD Edwards goes through that one user, and that one user communicates with the database. So when you look at the database side, all the transactions on there are just being done by one user. So we can't tell that Mr. Jones is the one causing this problem. All we know is that JDE is doing it. So it takes a little effort to kind of piece that stuff together back on the JDE side and back and forth between JDE and the database. And web servers are a little even more difficult, is that they consolidate all of their connectivity through a single process. So if you have a process that you're trying to trace back from the database and it goes to a web server, it's not really helpful because it's going back to the main Oracle, the WebLogic process. And this invariably results in confusion for DBAs and CNCs trying to sort out performance problems. JDE logs don't help too much sometimes, and it's one thing to see a scary message in the logs too, but is it actually causing a problem for someone? And I'm sure you've all seen it. Anybody who's parsed the JDE logs or even alerts from databases, there are things in there that say warn and severe, but they don't actually mean anything. That could just be, all of that could just be informational. And not to say that there isn't scary messages in the logs, but you know what I guess what I'm trying to say, if a message pops up in the logs and nobody's complaining about it, probably not something to worry about. But that's, it doesn't always happen in all cases. And there's a lot of components between JD Edwards and the database that could cause issues that would show up in the JDE logs. There's network cards, cables, routers, switches, operating systems, people tripping over cords, who knows. And those all show up, when you have a tight relationship between JD Edwards and the database, and something gets in there and interrupts that, JD Edwards is going to be the one, the application is going to find that out through its logs. The database doesn't really keep track of that. So, you have all these alarming messages in the logs, and we'll try to sort through some of those that may or may not be a problem. And database errors could come up due to problems with how the JD Edwards application has been set up, or maybe even how the database has been set up. So how do you narrow all this stuff down? I hope I didn't confuse too many people with that, but you have to obviously search for the error. The easy stuff, there's really when you first see your error, you don't have to go crawling down into the nuts and bolts of JD Edwards or the database to track something down if it's already been figured out before. If you have your own knowledge base that you bring with you as a CNC, you know how JD Edwards works. You know how it's, if something happens, you can kind of piece together how it would have gotten to that point. Just knowing how OCMs and data sources and and that fit together, you might be able to narrow it down on your own. Of course, there's your company knowledge base, your friends around you. Oracle support has a lot of information. One tip I give people on Oracle support is turn off Power View if you even have it. So if you know what Power View is, it's a way to filter all your search results. So when you go in to search for something and you're just interested in JD Edwards, you can have it search only the JD Edwards part. Now I find that, since I'm doing database and JD Edwards, I sometimes forget when I'm searching for a database thing and I have my JD Edwards power filter on, the database stuff doesn't pull up. So it's one thing to look at. Turn off that power filter, or maybe turn it on. You're getting too many results. If you're searching for an error in Google, I say this in many webcasts, be careful what you get out there. There's a lot of good information out there, but there's also a lot of weird and bad information and completely misinform you at every turn. So in the Google searches, I say try to find 5 or 6 things that relate to your error, that relate to your issue, and put them together and see where they all meet. And hopefully it's all going to point to one error, but don't find the first thing and then go for it. And if you're lucky to have access to other JDE experts or database administrators, talk to them. And finally, open an Oracle ticket. And not everybody thinks that opening an Oracle ticket, it might be justified right in the beginning. But I personally, if within about 30 minutes, I think that, and I think most people can do this, is that you figure out that you're pretty sure that this is not going to be solved in a reasonable amount of time. So I start opening a ticket and collecting all the logs and throw the ticket out there. Maybe I'll fix it in the next hour, but it's better to have the ticket open and waiting for you, so that 2 hours down the road when you're on the production down call, they ask, have you opened a ticket? And you say no. You'd rather say yes to that. So go ahead and open a ticket early, open them often. If you solve it, great, close the ticket with the resolution and move on. But it's due to the lag time sometimes you experience with Oracle tickets, it's better to get that done early rather than after somebody has to tell you to do it. And another good thing too is that what I find is I'm collecting logs for these tickets and getting the information that they need. It helps me troubleshoot the problem, and that's how a lot of people end up solving the issue, is by trying to collect everything that Oracle needs to start troubleshooting that. So let's get into an actual problem. How do you solve problems that come in on the database? So it's really, when you boil it down, there's just 2 kinds of problems. One is you get hit with a problem without warning, or you already know what you're about to troubleshoot. So if you, the most common thing you're going to do is something's going to hit and you're going to have to dive in and start collecting logs and try to find something really fast. You may not be looking for anything very deep, but you need to get something so that you can just get stuff running, especially if it's production. A lot of in-depth troubleshooting and root cause analysis is not appropriate at that time. You just want to get everything back up and running. But maybe after that, or you have some things that you want to look at that are not production down, but maybe have been affecting you. There are some things you can do to prepare in advance and make it much easier to track down issues on a database. So you have no warning, so something hits, and you got to start looking at things. If you get hit with a production down situation, call your DBA, call your database administrator if you're a CNC. If the DBA gets a database error, like the listener can't be found, get a CNC involved right away, because there's not too many production-related JDE issues that aren't also database issues, and vice versa. If the database goes down for any reason, then obviously JDE goes down. Now, if there's something else that is not JDE Edwards and not database, you still want to get the 2 together, because as you try to find what's in the middle causing this, it's better to have everybody on time. So when you get in as a CNC, what can you look at inside JDE? And I have a few things on here. So you can look at things like execution detail, the JDE logging, and another app. It's a P95-400. So let me show you some of that stuff here. If it's a UBE, obviously you can just go into the submitted job search. Like if a DBA says, hey, this process on your enterprise server is causing an issue, and don't worry, I'm going to show you a little bit later how that is done. Maybe it lines up with a UBE, and inside your the submitted job search, it lists everything. And if you look further, sorry, my hand disappears if I go too far. If you look further down the way, it shows the process ID. So if somebody says it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the server, and it's a UBE, then bam, you found the issue. You found the exact UBE that's causing the problem. And if you find that UBE, the DBA doesn't know what's going on. It knows that there's a session. It knows that this session has been doing things, and the DBA can kind of see some of the SQL statements that are running through it, but they may not know the origination of it. So the next thing you can do is do the execution detail. So that's a row exit, and that goes in and shows you a bunch of information about that particular session. And I'm sure every good CNC knows about this, but the execution detail shows some really good data in there. You want to go over to the SQL Statement tab at the end, and that shows the SQL statement that it's issuing to the database. Copy that, send that to the DBA. They can use that information and plug that into their database tool and find that exact SQL and see how it's performing and let you know where it's hanging up, if it's hung up at all. But so if you have an issue like that as a CNC, give them the SQL statement. Another way to find SQL statements, obviously, is through the JDE logging. Inside the JDE logs, you can see the SQL statements, but they have the bind variables stripped out. So if you look in this particular log, you see the select T0, blah, 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 and all that stuff. It doesn't wrap around. So the bind variables sometimes are shown in the logs below it, which is whatever values are assigned to the where clauses and things like that. Send that to the DBA, and they can use that to track down the specific problems with that. And it could be it needs an index, or maybe it got hung up, or you're pulling back too much data. But without this particular SQL statement, you're going to have a hard time tracking down what the actual problem is. Another cool thing that I've started using is the application failure recovery tool, which is P95-400. Now, this in and of itself doesn't really, you can't go in there and look at that and say, oh, okay, well, here's my CNC problem. You want to use that in conjunction with another problem. Say, for example, and I'll show this a little bit later about blocking. Say there's a blocking session going on, and you look on the database, and it's this session, which is on this other server. One thing to look at real quick is the application failure recovery, because you can't often tell what users are doing what, even when you have all that info. But if you correlate it to the application failure recovery, there might be some stuff in there, like you see right here. There's a bunch of catastrophic failures, the P4114 from the user JDE. But if you were to look in there and see that it was John Smith who had a failure, and they're also the person sitting on that call object kernel that has been identified by the database query, then you're starting to put two and two together and figure out, well, maybe this was John Smith doing this one thing, and now you are almost at the root cause. And then you go to John Smith and say, hey, what were you doing? Did you go home? Did you click out? Did you have a failure? Any on-screen messages? And then it helps you look inside the server manager logs to find the exact error. Speaking of server manager, this is what server manager looks like. I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but there's a little bit more information later on about how to click through and get stuff from server manager. But that's obviously a key tool. If somebody gives you the process ID, you can find the information about every process that's running in JD Edwards, and working with the DBA, find out where this stuff is going. And at the end of this, I'm going to go through an exercise of how to track down a database blocking session, and I'll show you more detail about how Server Manager and the database work together. Now, that's all on the JD Edwards side. On the database side, depending on which database you have, there are a number of tools you can use to find information about database sessions. We'll start with SQL Server. There is in SQL Server a thing called Activity Monitor, and it's included with SQL Server. If you right-click on the top of the name of the server at the top and click Activity Monitor, it'll show everything that's happening on the database, including how much memory it's using, what the sessions are doing, and so on and so forth. There's also some built-in stored procedures called SPWho and SPWho2, which are on SQL Server. SPWho3 is kind of a third-party thing, but really the best one is SPWhoisActive, which was developed by a third-party person, but it returns so much great information. And on SQL Server, we use that all the time to quickly find information about sessions. So this is what this is the kind of thing that SP Who is active can return. I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, up on the screen there, you see the SP Who is active, and then this particular query is looking for blocking sessions. So we're looking for the lead blocker, and we're sorting it by the sessions that are blocked. So if you see here, there's no blocking in this one. It's a little difficult to create blocking sessions, and it takes a little bit extra time. I didn't do that for this, but if you look all the way over to right, let's see, right there, the block session count, at the very top of this column is where the block leader, and it's going to show up there how many sessions it's blocking. And then down below, this null column that I'm kind of behind right here, that's going to show the sessions. So for each one of these lines here, that column will show the sessions that's blocking it. So you can follow through those numbers. You know, it could say that session 153 is blocking, so you go to 153, and then that's the session you will end up killing. More on that later. Now on the Oracle database, there are a bunch of tools there as well. There's Oracle Enterprise Manager 12c if you have Enterprise Edition. There's the OEM Database Express, then the old DBConsole if you're on 11G, SQL Developer, Toad, and then just regular SQL statements. This is the old DBConsole. So anybody who's been around forever, this is 11G. DBConsole doesn't exist in 12c anymore. So if you're moving from 11G to 12c, you can say goodbye to DBConsole. But this is the main screen here. It shows the status of the database, and if you go into performance, you can list the top sessions, and a DBA can find your sessions and go in and find the session that's causing the most problems right away, and then tell you, the CNC, the information about that and where it's coming from. And that's in 12c. They've replaced this with Database Express. It's a prettier version. It kind of matches grid control, cloud control. It does all the same things. The DBA can still drill down into sessions and find out where they're coming from, how long they've been going on, are they executing properly, do they need an index and things like that. So the information that you would give as a CNC, like, hey, here's that SQL statement, they can go in and use the Database Express to find every iteration of that SQL statement and then give you the information on how to troubleshoot that. Now, if you're a big shop, you're going to have Cloud Control. Cloud Control is very similar to Database Express, very similar to DBConsole. Cloud Control is designed to manage every component of an Oracle system, WebLogic, storage, and everything else, including the database, file systems, operating systems, the hardware, and so forth. But it also has all the same tools that the DBConsole had, and you can drill into the same information there. Now, most people, a lot of people don't have Cloud Control. Maybe you don't have the license for that. The OEM Database Express has to be installed. It's a separate package. So if you don't have that installed, a lot of people are using the free tool SQL Developer. Now, SQL Developer, like I said, is free. It comes with the Oracle client installation, and you can also download it separately. It includes all of the packages and everything you need to run this software. So inside SQL Developer, you can just about manage the entire database with this tool. Now, right here is a query that I use to select information from the submitted jobs table. But you can see that we can pull out the same information there as you can inside the application. So as a CNC, a DBA could go in if they have the process information and correlate that immediately with jobs that are running. Can't do that with kernels, unfortunately, but with UBEs you can. But SQL Developer is an excellent tool, and I'll show some more information about that in a little bit. Let's see. So if you could plan ahead, though, let's say you got the problem, that you had your problem and you solved it, and you and your CNC worked together to connect these two the processes on the database and on the JDE, but now you need to go back and look at it and try to figure out how to recreate it, maybe do some more intense troubleshooting. The first thing to do is to remove the layers of abstraction that are built into to JD Edwards, and it starts with a system user. So you have just one JDE system user. You could create a new system user, and it doesn't affect your JD Edwards installation at all. You create a new system user and assign that to a test user. Now when that user does anything inside JD Edwards, it goes through that new user to the database on a corresponding database user, and now all of their activity is tracked separately, and you can follow just that user and everything that they do. So if you have somebody who's trying to recreate an issue, don't let it get all mixed in with the rest of the database stuff. Create a system user just for testing and let them run through it. Like I said, it doesn't affect JD Edwards' performance at all. It's just a way to separate out the activity from everybody else. And another thing you can do that doesn't really require a system user is to turn on the user level JAS logging on the in Server Manager, which I think, well, I had a picture of that. I have a picture of it later in the slides. But inside Server Manager on the web server, you can go in and add a log that only captures information for a single user. So even if you do create a new system user, go ahead and do individual logs on that one user. And those individual logs can be very detailed. And then when you hand the DBA the SQL statements that you see in that log, then they can correlate that directly to the users and even start building up transaction lists. Now, call object kernel logging is a little more difficult. I mean, the call object kernels are shared. So if you have 5 users on a kernel, there's going to be a lot of information in there that relates to all those 5 users. Obviously, the things that a user directly does, like issues a SQL statement or starts a command, is going to have their name associated with it, but there's a lot of other things in there that aren't, not really directly associated. So call object kernel logs should be used in conjunction with the other logging that you find on the web server. And I already mentioned the separate database user. So now let's talk about some common situations. This is where I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this and show you the commands and actual statements and things from logs that are going to put all this together for you. So they're inside, when you look at JDE logs, there are going to be database related messages. Some of those come from the database and some of those come from the database client. They actually all come through the database client, but some of them only originate at the client. They don't come from the database, and I'll go over some of those here. So here's an example of a couple of error messages in a JDE. This is a JAS log that are from the database being sent up into the JDE log. Got one here saying that they're unable to execute a command, and then the top one is an alter table, and the next one unable to execute an update for because there's an Oracle error. Well, the top one, just from a DBA perspective, to give you the answer real quick, is that this error is saying that the user that they're trying to alter this table, it's usually when you click OMW, generate table, or something like that, it's going to try to create these tables and create the columns. Sometimes if you have your security set up very restricted, you're not going to have permissions to do that, and you'll have to work with the DBA. So anytime you see unable to execute in your JDE logs, that is a permissions issue on the database. And this one specifically. If you see an unable to execute like this, and see it's the second error that really tells you what the problem is. The bottom error says unable to extend table. So when you see unable to extend, that's something the DBA's got to do too, because what it's telling you is that whatever object it is it's trying to insert that data into, they can't make it any bigger. Either if the disk space has run out or the space that's been set aside for that particular table space has run out, don't know. If you see unable to extend, DBA's got to change something on the database in order to make that work. And those unable to extend errors, that could really quickly lead to a database crash. So those are some that you have to get a DBA in immediately. Here's a couple more here that come from the database too. But this first one is unique constraint violated. So when you first look at this error, you think, oh, well, there's something wrong with the database. I can't insert my data. But what it's really saying is that the data you're trying to insert is already in the table, and the database won't let you do that. It is trying to protect itself and it's going to reject that attempt. So if you see unique constraint violated, that means you need to figure out why the database thinks you're entering the same information again. And this can happen when you're doing bulk uploads or copy and pasting things from Excel into the grid and then hitting save. It's going to try to insert all that stuff. And if the key columns that the table is indexed on already have that data, regardless of what's in the other ones, it's going to reject it just like that. That's not something the DBA can fix, except I guess they could just delete the row that's in the table, but that's easier than it sounds. I mean, it's not easier. It's harder than it sounds because we don't know what it was trying to do. The JDE logs don't say what record caused the issue. They don't capture that information. The second one, unable to create user session on the database server. Now this one's kind of like, obviously this is from the database and CNC is not going to be able to do it. But these errors, these last two screens of errors, what I showed you in this snippet, that's the kind of thing you need to give to the DBA so that they can properly troubleshoot the issue. So, and if you just tell them, hey, I can't connect, then they don't have anything to go on. Because if you can't connect to the database doesn't always record that information. It can't tell. So you need to give them this specific, and just this little amount from the logs, paste it in the email, shoot it over to them, and they'll be able to jump on it right away. Now, there's some messages that come from a client, and with all these messages, I can't possibly put every single message that could ever pop out from a database, but just a few examples should be enough. There are some that you get from the client. Here, this one says, this is a SQL Server database disconnect. You can see at the top it says database connection has been lost, connect failure, and so on and so on. This message is coming from the client that is on the server or the workstation that you're sitting on. This could have something to do with database, but it might not, and it usually doesn't. This is just saying that the client tried to go to the database and it couldn't. But there's a lot of stuff between the database and the client, and I have a really cool slide that illustrates that. But this is only coming from the client. This is not sent from the database to the client. This is just the client doing it. And here's another message. This is Oracle database disconnect. So you see that the common word in here is database connection has been lost. That usually is a result of something between JDE and the database that has gone wrong. Not always. If the database crashes, you'll see this, but you might also see some other errors too. Another thing that is hard on troubleshooting things between JDE and the database is JDE security. In JDE security, in the background, there are a lot of things that happen that a user doesn't necessarily know about. So if you're in a company, you go into the grid and you put in some values in the QBE fields and hit find, or just do an open find or whatever, you're thinking that it sends this statement directly to the database as is, but what you don't know in the background is that if you have any kind of security whatsoever, JD Edwards adds on a bunch of stuff to the bottom of that SQL statement and then sends it to the database. And the effect of that is that people with different security are sending different SQL statements to the database. And an interesting thing about databases is that if one SQL statement differs from another by only a space or one extra argument, the database considers that a completely different statement and will could handle it in a completely different way. So when you're troubleshooting and you're saying, hey, this operation is slow, it's very important for the CNC to test that operation without security, with a different user. Try to get it from a couple different angles because the SQL statements that are being sent by the application are different. And this gets a little bit more complicated in 9.2 data source security. They've moved a lot of the security has changed. Back in the old days with Oracle Public Shutdown being necessary, all of the permissions for all objects inside JDE Edwards before 9.2 were assigned to everybody, and you couldn't change that. So you couldn't create any read-only users. So now in 9.2, with the changes to that, and there's some misunderstandings about how to disable the public grants and how to set up data store security. I have a whole webcast on this, which I did a couple weeks ago. You can find it on the GSI website. But the security confusion causes a lot of errors that seem like database issues, and they will show up on the logs saying that a database can't do something, or they'll show up as database performance issues, but they're really caused by the security being added on the end of SQL statements. So in some cases that might mean you need to change how you apply security to users, but you know, it's a case-by-case basis, really. We had one client just in the last couple of weeks have an issue with this, and here's a query similar to that. So I left out the top of this query. So this is from a JDE log. I left out the top of this query, which was select, and then it had a whole bunch of columns for 3 different tables, but that was so long, and it didn't really matter to this. So this is the where clause. So select blah, where, and then here's your arguments. So see that the first line up there says where the GL, OBJ, and so on and so forth. And then it's got an and then some more stuff. And then that next break, the and, everything below there is added by business unit security. So you can see that this company has business unit security that is very choppy. So they only have individual sections of the business unit that whoever this user was, that's all they can access. Well, as they add more and more and more things to that, it makes the query more and more complicated and also different. So getting the exact query, no matter how big it is extremely important to troubleshooting and connecting things between JDE and the database. So in this particular query, there was over 200 lines of data sort and business unit security added to this this operation, which caused 400 and something nested loops and a lot of slowness. And then at the very end of this query, you see the rest of the ands, ors, ands, ors, ands, ors, and then at the very bottom is the rest of the JDE query that is tacked onto the end. And then, and this is something not everybody knows about. At the bottom there it says order by. When you set up data sequencing in JD Edwards, that is on the database called an order by. So when you have a SQL statement that you have all of these comparisons, so it did all this work to do all these ands and ors and the not ends and the betweens and stuff, and it built the whole data set. And in this case, this data set was like 1 billion records, so it was never going to display. But let's say that it was 100,000 records. So once it's collected all of that information, and then it looks at the bottom, oh, there's an order by. It needs to be in a specific order. But it takes that whole data set and puts it into another space on your database. On Oracle, it's a temporary table space. On SQL Server, it's the temp DB. Takes that entire data set, stuffs it into that temporary database, and then resorts it completely, and then sends it to your client. So whenever you're finding that, and DBAs, this is for you, if somebody sends you a query saying, oh, this is taking forever, run it on your database tool, comment out the order by, and see how fast it comes back. Because it could be that the order by is what's causing all the issues. Because if you take a giant data set and you just run through it and deliver it to the client, that's not too bad. But when you take that giant data set and then have to use up the temp database to resort it, that can slow everybody down. So let's go back to, sorry, so I showed you earlier this unable to execute, and then I also showed you the database disconnections, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what could cause these database disconnect messages. And more often than not, it's network issues. There's something between JDE Edwards and the database. Now this is this mess behind me here is an actual network diagram that I pulled off the internet. So you can see that, maybe this guy right here, is that right? Yeah, this guy right here is trying to connect to a database on the other side over there, but there's so many other connections. There's Ethernet cables, there's InfiniBand, there's backbones, and storage controllers, servers, switches, routers, and just so many things that could be an issue, plus everything else that's connected to that network If you get a database disconnect, it doesn't necessarily mean it was the database. It doesn't mean it was JD Edwards, but it could mean that you need to bring in your network people. And I say all this because network and database disconnects often cannot be troubleshot from the database side or the JDE side because there's just not enough information. We don't know what caused it. All we know is that they were disconnected somehow. And for some reason, 9.2, I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, but 9.2 seems really susceptible to network disconnects. It's gone up quite a bit in the last 6 months. And some of the things that it can affect are the next numbers. And I'm sure you all know how next numbers works. What happens is their query comes to the database, and it grabs that row for that next number. Let's say just the address book one up here. It grabs that row for address book next numbers, and it does a select for update, which locks that row. Nobody else can use that, which makes sense because you don't want someone to grab another number that you were going to use. It locks that, and then it increments the next number by 1. It grabs the number it needs, increments it by 1, and then lets go. Now the problem is that some applications sometimes take a little bit too long to grab that next number, and it introduces a little tiny window of time where if a network hiccup happens right in there, it disconnects that session, and now you've locked that next number row. If you're trying to get next numbers on work orders, let's say you do 100 work orders a day or 1,000 or 10,000 a day, and one thing comes in there and locks your next numbers, then all of a sudden your entire company halts because one person left a lock on a next number table. Now the other next number tables, a couple others in there. The F0022 is a next number table inside business data, and F986111 is the next number table for your submitted jobs. So there's many places where these things can be locked up. And network issues don't have to happen between JDE and the database. It could be a network issue caused by, say, DSI, for example, which uses network, which goes through JDE, but if the DSI server disconnects from JDE, then once the information tries to go back to the DSI server to send that next number, now you also have a disconnect. And network disconnects can also disconnect the kernels, especially the XML. There's something about a sequence number. If it can't catch up at sequence numbers, then the XML kernels will die and you can't restart them. And this is the reason why you have to restart JD Edwards after a major database disconnect. So now let's look into database blocking. And this is where I'm going to show you a great example of how to connect the database with JD Edwards. So first, a note on blocking. Blocking is caused by the application. And it's a normal function of the database. It happens hundreds of times a minute. And normally, nobody monitors blocking because it's just happens so much that it doesn't really rise to the level of urgency. Now, in JD Edwards, it's a little bit different. JD Edwards has a lot of transactions inside of it that cause extended blocking. Sometimes up to 10 minutes is normal. But that blocking often is just within a single application. Like someone will be going through screens in some application that has multiple commits that will just block itself by its very nature. And that's why we don't monitor for blocking over 10 minutes long, under 10 minutes long. But once it goes past that, then we have to get alerted. Most applications don't cause this kind of extended blocking, but it is in there. It can also be caused by, blocking can be caused by just having too much data. And in that case, the blocking is normal. It's just that the session doing the blocking is trying to get so much done that everybody else is kind of waiting behind. It's like the person at the bank teller window counting out all their stuff in pennies. There's nothing wrong with the transaction. It's just whatever they're doing, it's just taking too long. Bad development. I used to be a JDE developer as well, so I'm not trying to badmouth JDE developers, but bad development can cause blocking if they have they don't do the closed tables or they don't use index columns. That can slow things down and cause blocking. And then ad hoc reporting is a really big contributor to blocking, since a lot of ad hoc reporting tools allow people to create reports in any way that they want. And if they don't search on index columns, or they decide to get some really complicated joins and things like that in there, they can really bog down the database. But the kind of blocking that we usually find these days is from database disconnects, JDE sessions that have been disconnected from the database. And we need to find out who was that. Is it really a disconnect, or is it just somebody who walked away from their workstation? We need to get a hold of them. So how do we do that? So for a DBA, first thing you got to do is find the blocking. Now, and if you have a report or a process that monitors this, we at GSI, we have our monitors that collect all this information automatically. But this is how you do it manually. So in Oracle database, you want to do a select from $G session blockers. The reason there's a G on there, if those of you who are Oracle DBAs, you know, people talk about the $V views, put a G in front of it, that will search every rack node. So if there's multiple nodes of the database, GV views are the same as V views, but they search all of the nodes. There's also SQL Developer, which has the blocking locks by user report, and my favorite, which is Toad and the session browser. So here's your Oracle query. Now I didn't have any blocks, but if you run select from $G session blockers, it'll show all of the information that you see up here for the blocker. You as a DBA need to take that, find the originating the originating server and the user, send that to the CNC, and tell them you guys need to figure out how to fix this, or let me know and I'll kill it. And on a note on killing things, don't kill anything without getting client's approval, because you don't know if they're in the middle of a transaction or if there's some kind of integrity issue that you could cause. I know blocking sucks, but killing blocking can cause a lot of transaction rollbacks and integrity issues if you're not prepared for them. So let's move on. In SQL Developer, this tool right here, I just have it selected right here, is if you go to Tools up top across the command line, Tools and then Reports, it'll pop out that window, and you scroll down to Database Administration. There's other things in the tree above that. And then down to Locks, click on the blocking locks by user, and that'll show all your blocks if you don't feel like typing that query in. Toad is actually even better, but it's like $8,000 for the software. But you can go into Toad and just go into the session browser. And so when you go to the session browser, it shows those 4 tabs, which you can see in kind of the middle section there. And you click on the locks tab, and that'll show all the locks that are occurring. Now right here is a great example of why locks are not that big of a deal, because locks are happening all the time on the database. And at the moment that I took this snapshot, these were the locks that were happening right then. But none of them were blocking anything, which is fine. But if there was a blocker, there would be a check marks in the session blocked. And you can see just barely at the bottom of my screen where it says blocked locks and blocking locks. That's where it'll show you the information about the sessions that are blocked. And you give that information to the CNC. Now, if you find that there's a block and you don't have Toad, or you have SQL Developer, you can use this query here to find the originating process ID to give to the CNC, or you can throw that into a script. But this is basically what Toad and everything in the background is doing, is they're kind of running this to give you the information about the originating server and process ID, and the CNC is going to need that for them to be able to let you know. Okay, let's go on to SQL Server. In SQL Server, it's a little more difficult, but not really. I mean, you can use, I showed you earlier the SP who is active to find the blocks. So if somebody says, hey, I think there's blocking, my session's not coming back, this SP who is active, you just got to Google it. It's a free download from the internet, and it's a stored procedure. You install it, and then you can run this stored procedure for many, many different things, including finding blocking. But what this SP who is active can do, it'll show you the blocked session, the blocking, what it's blocking. And also, let me take a step back. One thing to note about when you're looking at blockers on the database is that SQL Server and Oracle and no database can really, truly tell you what is causing the blocking. They can tell you what session is causing it, and it will show you a SQL statement, but that is not necessarily the SQL statement that is causing the blocking. And you'll know when you look at the blocking, and it's like a select on the address book, but somebody who's trying to update the F1911 is getting blocked. But what the session isn't showing is what was blocking before. And it's causing an issue that you weren't able to capture. And on SQL Server, you can find the originating OS and PID by this really quick SQL statement here. It's so there's a metadata table called sysprocesses, and this is all going to be in this presentation. When you download it later, this information is all in there. A lot of my notes too, so don't worry about that. Now, if you really don't like SQL, you don't like typing SQL, and you don't want to worry about that, SQL Server has the activity monitor. Inside the activity monitor, it can show blocking and all the processes and the activity that's going on there. And it even has another report, which is called the all blocking transactions report. And that's, you just right-click on on the database in there. So if it's JDE Production, right-click on JDE Production, go down to Reports, Standard Reports, Activity, All Blocking Transactions. Now, we didn't see any blocking transactions here, but it would be there. And it would list the exact SQL statement that's causing it and the origination and everything like that. If it doesn't, you can always fall back on that query. Something weird about SQL Server, it's got this fetch API cursor thing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but there is a way to find out what the query is behind that fetch API cursor. And it's included in this presentation. Now you take all that stuff, and what do? You take it to Server Manager, take it to a CNC, who opens up Server Manager, takes your process ID and correlates it with a call object kernel on the inside JDE. So right up here is call object kernel 1413, and that was what we got. We said this is JDE ent01 process 1413 is causing the blocking. So the CNC goes in the Server Manager. They click on that call object kernel, and it lists the users. In this case, it was JDE, and JDE is trying to connect, is causing the blocking. So now we know Mr. JDE is out there. Since this was a lab system, obviously it's just me on there. If this was a real system, there might be 5 or 6 users. Something else to correlate it with is your web user sessions. You look on there and you can see what was Mr. JDE doing. Submitted job search, blah, blah, blah. So now we can kind of, so when Mr. JDE was in work with application failure records, that's where it started blocking. So let's go talk to him and say, what were you doing? And then you can piece this all together. So once you get the process ID on the server, the CNC takes that, tracks down the user, finds all that information. Once you have this stuff, you then send that to the client, or if you're the CNC for the company, find the business person who's in charge of that area, ask them, can you please log out, or what happened, close your session, can I kill this? The cool thing is on JD Edwards is if you kill the call object kernel from the command line that's causing blocking, it will stop the blocking on the database most of the time. If it doesn't, call the DBA. But if it comes to the point where you need to kill a blocker as a CNC, make sure you already have your DBA online ready to go, because you don't want to have to wait another 10 minutes to get somebody online. So the bottom line to all this is CNCs should be providing to the DBA the user, the tables they're accessing, and the SQL if they have it available, and that way they can look at their tools and find out what is going on. The DBA, if they see blocking, they have to provide to the CNC where is it coming from and who is the user, and then maybe some of the SQL, you can tell what's being blocked. Send them some of the SQL that's blocked, and that way they can say, oh, they can hand to the client. The client say, oh, well, that's the work order application, and that's this department, so I'm going to go check with that department. So by providing these bits of information to each other, you paint a full picture of what's going on, and give the business owners, the business analysts, the best tools in order to make a decision how they want to deal with that. All right, thanks for attending. I'm going to turn this back over to Amanda. I'm going to pull up my thingamabob here. I'm trying to change. There you go. You have control now?
Yes, I do. Okay. Okay, so thanks, Bill. And now I'd like to cover a few follow-up items, and then we'll move into the question and answer section of our webcast. Our webcast today is a part of GSI's free ongoing educational webcast series on JD Edwards. Our upcoming webcasts are listed on the screen, and if you'd like to view our most up-to-date schedule, you can visit our website at getgsi.com/JD/Edwards-webcasts. Sorry, wrong slide. There we go. Okay, so during the month of June, we will be hosting 2 free educational workshops on JD Edwards EnterpriseOne 9.2 upgrades. If you're interested and are in the Chicago or Irvine area and you would like to find out more information, you can go to getgsi.com/JDE-Edwards-conferences-events. So GSI provides extensive free educational resources for the JD Edwards community, including our weekly educational webcasts, our monthly newsletter called the GSI Insider, our online resource center where you can access hundreds of recorded on-demand webcasts, white papers, etc., and our on-site and virtual workshops. If you would like to sign up for weekly email reminders for upcoming webcasts, our monthly newsletter, or create an account to access our resource center, you can go to getgsi.com, go to the resources and events on the main menu, select JD Edwards, and then select the appropriate link on the right. So while I see that we've already had a question submitted online, I would like to remind everyone that if you would still like to submit a question, you can do so using the questions panel in the GoToWebinar console window on the right of your screen. If you minimized your console earlier, please click the left arrow to redisplay the questions panel. Okay, so our question comes from David, who asks, Veeam software snapshot restore is sometimes causing us to experience database disconnects. We've been told this is a known issue without any suggestion for addressing the issue other than to try and make sure the restore happens during a period of low activity. Do you have any suggestions on what else we might do?
Yes, absolutely. We've seen this a lot. And it is true, yes, it does cause the database disconnects because, and for those of you who don't know, the Veeam snapshot, it locks the database for an instant, hopefully, takes a snapshot and moves on. It usually happens within, microseconds, but it can happen a little longer. But the problem is JD Edwards is sensitive to that, so any kind of database locking could cause timeouts and disconnects. So the first thing to do to kind of fix that is, like you said, is have this happen during a period of low activity, but that doesn't always work. Unfortunately, you can't change the behavior of the locking or the sensitivity of JD Edwards. So we normally suggest a hybrid solution where the database backups are controlled by database tools. So basically set up a SQL Server backup, dump that back up to another disk or another file server, and then basically manage the database backups with the SQL Server, and keep those offline somewhere else, and take a gold level snapshot of the SQL Server that can be restored. That can be restored instantly, but then once you have that VM restored, then you pop in the database backups to bring your server back up. It's not instantaneous, but it does still provide disaster recovery, and it keeps the server from being disconnected due to snapshots.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill, and thanks, David, for your question. It appears to be the end of the questions. So as a follow-up from today's webcast, we ask that you complete a short 1-minute survey when you exit. You'll be receiving an email with a link to our resource center on our website where you can access the recording from today's webcast as well as a copy of the presentation. And after today's webcast, we will do the drawing for the $25 Amazon gift card, and anyone who attended the entire webcast will be eligible, and we will notify the winner. If you do have any follow-up questions, you can contact Bill or I, and we will get back to you. Our contact info is on the screen. Thanks again for attending our presentation, and we hope you have a great day.
Bye.